Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be looking at all the angles on the Israeli conflict and even some of the latest legal news in our Talking Liberty segment. We'll be joined by defense and Pentagon expert, also a former Air Force pilot, Mr. Dave Patterson, and Liberty Nation staple, the legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. But first, we're talking with America's most syndicated columnist, prolific author whose latest book, A Watchman in the Night, is available just about everywhere, and well worth a read, I might add, Mr. Cal Thomas, who joins us now, and as ever will hopefully shed a little light on what is often a subject obscured by the fog of war. Hi, Cal. Thanks for being here today.
Delighted, Mark. Always a pleasure to be with you. A real thinker in the UK.
Thank you. I like to consider myself such. I'm not sure anybody else does, but I appreciate the kind words. Now, Cal, obviously the story for us to discuss today, it's Israel, the ongoing humanitarian crisis there, the war, the age-old arguments that are again being brought to the fore, which I think is something that people aren't really tuning in on. That they're making new arguments as though these are revelations, and that's not the case. It's the age-old arguments that have been used for the last 75 years. But Cal, can we start off? Can you give us your overall thoughts on what's happening? Just general thoughts.
Well, there are two narratives, Mark, and have been really since the reestablishment of Israel in the land of its ancestors in 1948. One is Israel, the Zionists, are an illegal occupier of Palestinian land. They threw Palestinians out of their homes, and most are now refugees and demand to be returned, or at least compensated. The other is that the Jews have had a presence in the land for nearly 4,000 years. They came back in 1948 following the Holocaust to their ancient homeland, and they deserve to have it there. Now, there's a lot of anti-Semitism rolled up in this. There is, a continuation of, according to some of the mullahs in Iran and elsewhere, of Hitler's final solution. They believe that their God, they call Allah, wants them to kill Jews, eradicate Israel, then come after what they call the cross worshippers, that would be the Christians, even moderate Muslims, and certainly unbelievers or other infidels, as they call them. So if you understand those two narratives, then you understand that's everything that's happening. And every event that happens there is plugged into one of those two narratives. We saw that with the Gaza hospital alleged bombing, the first word out from Hamas. And believe me, they have all this structure. This play has been written in advance. First word is, those evil Israelis bombed the hospital, killed 500 people, including a lot of children. That went around the world, demonstrations ensued. But then,
if I may add, Cal, that was also the first line from the New York Times.
Yes, of course. Well, they're in league with everything on MSNBC. But as soon as the truth came out, which, by the way, was broadcast first by Al Jazeera, not exactly a Zionist entity, and showed that in fact, it was not an Israeli missile, but a misfired missile from Islamic Jihad, another terrorist group, that didn't do anything to the demonstrations around the world and to much of the press coverage because they hate Israel. So that's all you need to know, and that's it.
Well, it very much is a case of that. There's two perspectives, and everybody's being asked, or in fact forced in many ways, to pick a side on that. And I think what we've seen, as you say, around the world with all these embassies being attacked, days of rage, days of jihad that have been called for. I think we're seeing that people have picked a side, and that there's a lot of ugliness just buried beneath a very thin veneer of civility and allegedly shared values that we all thought prior to October 7th that we all had. And that appears not to be the case anymore, does it?
No. And then the other big mistake, and you saw this in President Biden's interview on 60 Minutes, and he has reiterated it in the past, and so did Obama before him, and Bill Clinton, and even Republicans, that what is needed is a Palestinian state. Well, I wrote in one of my columns this week, if you want to know what a Palestinian state would look like, look at Gaza. I was opposed to the unilateral withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza because it created a vacuum, and the vacuum was filled by Hamas. And Hamas is a terrorist organization supported by Iran, and they were expected to, and in fact did follow through by launching attacks on Israeli civilians, babies, elderly people, disabled people, women and children. It was as predictable as the sun rising in the morning, Mark. And this particular incident in early October was a massive intelligence failure. When some kind of stability is restored here, and hopefully Hamas is defeated, there's going to be a major investigation of this. The head of Shin Bet has already acknowledged that he failed. Bibi Netanyahu hadn't said anything about it yet. U.S. intelligence gave no information about this. How do you plan such a massive operation with all the technical spy equipment available today and paying off possible, people to tell what's going on? How does that all happen, and all the tunnels and everything else, without anybody knowing about it? That's going to be one of the big questions in an investigation.
Yeah, I think the idea that it was just a spur of the moment attack because Hamas had a bunch of rockets lying around, I think that's a foolish way to look at it, because you had air, land, sea, and a cyber attack that took place. I believe denial of service attacks. So essentially, I don't think people really realize that with the denial of service attack, that meant that things also couldn't get out of Israel. So whatever Israel was trying to tell the world about what was happening, they couldn't, not to the degree they wanted to. And so that allowed Hamas and Hamas's backers, Iran, for example, to kind of craft a narrative about what's happening across social media before Israel could put out what's happening to them. And that's planning. So let's talk about Iran for a moment.
Let me add one other quick thing here, Mark. I think it follows up on what you were saying. Look how fast the reporting has shifted. For the first few days, it was all about the horror that was perpetrated on Israel and the innocent people who died and the people who were kidnapped and are being hostage. And then I knew it was coming. The narrative began to shift fairly slowly at first, but now more rapidly. Look at the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Look at those evil Israelis cutting off electricity and water. Look at them bombing seemingly indiscriminately when it's not. They know where the targets are of Gaza. And look at all the damage and destruction, and children are being killed. So we're hearing less and less and less on what precipitated all of this, which is an invasion by these terrorists, these Hamas terrorists, into Israel and killing a lot of people and seizing a lot of people. And some of those killed are Americans. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And the media, of course, is playing its usual role in this.
Very, very much so. I believe it's at least 30 Americans have been known to be being killed in this so far at time of recording. So with Iran, clearly Iran has hostility. I think that's the lightest way to say it towards Israel.
Yes.
But they are also, as we well know, as everybody knows, as the Biden administration knows, they're the world's biggest sponsor, largest sponsor of international terrorism. That includes Hamas and Hezbollah, which has begun attacking from the north there. Now, the Biden administration to date has been very reluctant to say that that Iran has a connection here. But surely, to get back to your point about there was an intelligence failure, all the intelligence that needed to be gathered to orchestrate that kind of multivariate, multi-pronged attack had to have come from Iran, right? It couldn't have come from Hamas. Hamas are essentially animals, just
Well, the other thing, Mark, what the administration is trying to do is save this Iran nuclear deal.
Hmm.
They still think it's possible. They think it's possible to make a deal with people who say that they want to wipe out the United States, wipe out Israel. We're the great Satan. Israel's the little Satan. They have a direct order from their God to do this, so it's righteous, and they will get virgins in heaven for doing so. How do you counter that? You can only counter it by force. You can't sit down at a negotiating table with people who want you dead and feel they have a mandate from their God to carry out your murder and say, well, let's see. All right, we'll agree. Instead of murdering you by a bomb, we'll murder you by bullets. How's that? That is your compromise position. We are in complete denial about this. Letting Iran have a nuclear bomb will ensure that they will use it first on Israel and possibly here. North Korea, for example, has already said they've got ICBMs that can reach Los Angeles, the west coast of America. We need to send a clear message to Iran. If you get the bomb, and especially if you use the bomb, your entire country will be turned into sand, and mean it. And it has to come like that. It has to be that strong. You will be completely annihilated. And, I would love to see regime change there, but we're not going to be able to do that. You saw what happened when they had the last election, which was fake, and people demonstrated. They either killed them or put them in prison. These people are pure evil, and evil cannot be accommodated. It must be rejected and destroyed.
On that note, we'll be back right after this short break with Cal Thomas. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Cal Thomas. We were just talking about Iran and the influence that they've had over everything. And you mentioned, Cal, that a lot of the reluctance for the Biden administration to tie Iran into this is because they still want public approval for the Iran nuclear deal. And you said how disastrous that would be for both Israel and possibly for the United States. And you mentioned very briefly there that North Korea as well. Now, latest news is that the Hamas have weapons that are built in North Korea. So either North Korea is providing these weapons directly to Hamas. I'm not sure how the shipping routes work there, or the the air routes work, or somebody is acting as a middleman for them. Now, we presume, would that be Iran, or is that somebody else, do you think?
Well, I forget who, I guess it was George W. Bush who created the line axis of evil. We've had axes of evil before, but we've dealt with it by defeating it. You look at World War II as a perfect example. We didn't negotiate with Japan. In fact, we were negotiating with Japan when they slipped up on us and hit Pearl Harbor. We didn't negotiate with Germany. There's still people who think that we overdid it with the atom bomb. 2 bombs dropped on Japan, and basically the firebombing of cities in Germany like Dresden. People still argue about that. But the fact is, Hitler and the Emperor of Japan were defeated. And we haven't had any problem with them in over 70 years. They are peaceful nations. That's the kind of objective that we ought to have, not accommodation, but elimination. If you're not going to join the family of nations and behave yourself, then civilized nations need to unite and overturn or destroy those who would expand evil in the world.
It reminds me, just a brief aside, that the Orson Scott Card series, Ender's Game, where the young Andrew Ender tries to defeat his enemy so badly that there'll never be another day where the enemy comes back. And I guess that's the way that the international community is looking to deal with these. Well, half the international community is looking to deal with Hamas. Now, Cal, I hope it's not betraying any confidence here, but you are a personal friend of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and I was wondering if you could give us some insight into what his situation is at the moment, or where he's heading with things.
Well, it depends on how things turn out. I've known him since he was the deputy chief of mission at the Israeli embassy in Washington. I think we've known each other, I don't know, 25 or 30 years. I was just with him, spent about 45 minutes with him in Jerusalem in his office this past spring. We talked about a number of things, American politics, his new book, which is wonderful, called Bibi, which he wrote during COVID when he had the time to do it. Some tremendous insights. Just as in America, the left in Israel hates him because he's been so successful. He's been the best defender of Israel that perhaps any prime minister has ever been, and the left just hates that. They're still under the false notion that peace can be made with Israel's enemies. If there is to be a side benefit to these horrific events that have transpired in just the last couple of weeks in Israel, for the time being, it's pretty much united the left and the right. Something that happened after our 9/11. Democrats and Republicans were united, but of course it didn't take long before the split came again. So they're out to get him. They haven't been able to get him at the ballot box. So they're trying to get him through the judicial system and by other means. It's really disgusting, especially at a time of great peril for the country. Unity brings strength. Division brings weakness.
Yeah, as it always has been. Now, I know that Jake Sullivan recently said just before the hostilities broke out that things that have been very quiet in the Middle East, which is very much an egg on his face moment, let's be honest. But you and I were talking off camera about the reason why things had been quiet in the Middle East. If you wouldn't mind informing our listeners and viewers, Cal.
Well, when Jake Sullivan said things have been quiet the past few years, that's due to the Abraham Accords and the triumph of the Trump administration in putting together these Arab and Muslim nations that had never agreed to recognize Israel before to do so now. No other president has been able to do that. And I think, whatever one thinks of Trump, that if he had been reelected, he probably would have been able to bring Saudi Arabia into this. For reasons that include the Saudis' rivalry, religious rivalry with Iran, Sunni versus Sunni. Yeah, the other one. I can't get them mixed up sometime. So now that Biden, who appears weak on these things and indecisive, is running the show in Washington, the Saudis are reluctant to join in. So when Jake Sullivan talks about peace, of course, the absence of a war doesn't mean a war isn't being planned. And we've seen that. I mean, this, as you mentioned earlier, this whole Hamas thing didn't just happen overnight. They didn't wake up one morning and say, let's go attack Israel. This was a long time in planning. Those tunnels, the airborne things that they rode over the border with, all of this stuff was very well planned.
We're almost out of time, Cal. You could give us your final word on the situation, please.
Well, I'm not a prophet or the son of one, Mark, so I don't know how it's going to turn out. But Ronald Reagan's great line, peace through strength, works. It's worked in history, even ancient history. It's worked in recent history. You'll remember when the Ayatollah Khomeini released the American hostages on January 20, 1981, he really thought that Reagan was a cowboy. He really thought that Reagan was going to bomb the world. And, they're not totally crazy in Iran. They would like to stick around a little longer. But that's what the kind of leadership you need. It doesn't mean you're going to bomb the world, but it means that you're going to show the world that you're capable of doing it if they go too far. And that will bring peace.
Peace through strength. Cal Thomas, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Strategic issues abound as Israel prepares to deal with attacks on multiple fronts. Does it have the capability? Is America likely to get more involved? And what does this mean for regional stability? And we're very lucky to be joined by a guest that just might be able to shed some light on these questions. A retired Air Force pilot and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, I'm sure I got it right that time, Mr. Dave Patson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, I guess the first question has to be, what is the one that's most important to our majority American audience? What is the likelihood of U.S. troops being on the ground in Israel? Now, I know that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he's notified a couple of thousand service members that they need to prepare for duty. But what does this mean in the real world?
Well, I think that possibility is remote at the current time. I don't see a reason for that. We do have probably some special operations forces that are providing advisory services to the Israel Defense Force. But in any numbers, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. The ball is really in Iran's court as to whether or not they foment violence enough in the north or to cause a problem for U.S. equities around the Middle East. And they have said that they might do that. But until that happens, I don't see a significant intervention by the U.S.
Right, because such an intervention would almost certainly be seen by Iran as a public escalation of the situation, right? So at the moment, you mentioned what's happening in northern Israel. There, you're talking about, I guess, Hezbollah, which is Iranian funded, as all of these places tend to be, launching rockets into Israel. But having troops actually on the ground, that would be almost an open affront to Israel, to Iran, and therefore that would give them the public justification that they've been seeking to get more involved and attack Israel directly. Is that pretty much the situation?
Yeah, I think that would be true. I think that Iran, however, will use any pretense, and
Absolutely.
currently their pretense that they would use is Israel doing a ground attack into Gaza, and they've said this is. And recently, their supreme leader Ali Khamenei, warned Israel to keep up the attacks of violence, and other fronts will be opened against them. And so I think that the focus is on what Israel does, not necessarily what the U.S. does, but the U.S. obviously will be a target as a consequence.
Yeah, the day we're recording this, Israel has not yet launched a ground attack into the regions. And this is on Wednesday, the 18th. President Joe Biden has just been visiting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I think for at least the last 4 days prior to now, Israel has been about to start a ground attack, but has held off. Now, the first day of that, the reason they gave was the weather wasn't right. Now, I can kind of understand that in for example, in Russia, the Russia-Ukraine area. Nobody goes to war in Russia in winter and is gonna survive well there. But since then, there's been some holding off. Now, do you think that holding off is due to the fear of the threats that Israel's making?
Oh, you mean Iran is making, right?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
It's all the eyes in the region.
Honestly, I don't think Israel gives two hoots about what Iran does in terms of their threats. Israel does not want a two-front war, but nonetheless is preparing for a Hezbollah attack. I don't think that that the Israel Defense Force is going to start a ground assault until they're absolutely ready. And the reason for that is urban warfare is probably the most difficult fighting that you can take place. People can hide in all manner of destroyed buildings and behind all kinds of
civilians, for example, can hide behind and among civilians.
Yes, obviously, and so it's very difficult to do it. I mean, and while you're trying to keep the violence against civilians as low as possible. Now, what makes it even more difficult is when Hamas, which they've shown a propensity to do, is to put civilians in the way as shields, but it still is a difficult proposition.
Yeah, you've been writing quite a bit about the carrier groups, strike carrier groups that are operating in the region. That's specifically the USS Gerald Ford and the Eisenhower, and all the ships that go along with them. Now, this is fascinating stuff. You can read about this on the pages of libertynation.com under Dave Patterson's byline there, and it really explains what a ship, because we hear about it on the news, we think, oh, there's a ship going. It's not a ship, is it, Dave? It's not like a single ship or two ships.
No, it's what it's called. It's a carrier strike group, and normally a carrier strike group will have a carrier, obviously, plus a cruiser, missile cruiser, and 4 destroyers, missile destroyers, and so that and all of the support ships that go with it, so you'll have a carrier that can carry up to 70 aircraft, including vertical, helicopters and so forth. But one of the things that it carries, which is really kind of important from a standpoint of not dropping bombs and killing people, is they have the E-2D Hawkeyes, which are basically a command and control aircraft, but they also have a lot of capability for coordinating and helping the Israelis on the ground with the communications. So it is a formidable force, and they also have the AF-18 Growlers that are electronic warfare aircraft, and they put out a lot of electrons and can disrupt the Hamas and Hezbollah communications. So there's a lot of capability there without, dropping bombs on folks.
Yeah, it seems that that's the kind of aid that wouldn't be looked upon by the international community as too much involved. Is in literally because of the command and control crafts, they can see what's happening across the area and provide real-time updates to literally everybody they want, right?
That's right. They have 360-degree radar capability, and so they can keep track of a lot of stuff that's particularly things like the drones that are possible that could come Israel's way. They would be able to see those.
So finally, Dave, Joe Biden, he's obviously been on the diplomatic mission to Israel. CNN said this should be quite a difficult diplomatic situation. I've written about it might be a difficult diplomatic situation. What's your take?
I would say it's not a difficult diplomatic mission. You said that you were supporting Israel, that you would support Israel for its needs, and behind it 100%. I believe the Biden administration likes to coin the phrase ironclad guarantee. And it's going to have to be, because as you can already see in Great Britain, that members of parliament are growing wobbly in their support, and you had 35 members of parliament who said that a ceasefire should be take place right away. Well, there should be no ceasefire, and nobody can grow wobbly on this. Israel was attacked in a horrific fashion, and it's time to get rid of Hamas once and for all, take away this scourge from the world.
Joe Biden might have his mission accomplished statement at the end. Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Gag orders abound for the former president as Jack Smith asked for President Donald Trump to be silenced on certain issues. Now, what are those issues? Is this affecting Donald Trump's First Amendment rights and his rights as a defendant, or his rights as a presidential candidate? To try and figure these out, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and general man about town, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. Thanks for joining us, Scott.
It's always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Scott, we all heard about the gag order that has been imposed on former President Donald Trump. Now, this is in the case being held in Washington, D.C., related to obstruction of an election and various things.
The federal criminal trial instituted by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith in federal district court in Washington, D.C. Yes,
On Pennsylvania Avenue, for those who wanted any more specific,
right.
I might
for being
add.
a bad person and not for voting against Joe Biden, apparently, is yeah. Not
Well,
to be
there's
flippant, but
yes, I do understand where you're coming from that. So what I really want to know with this, Scott, is he applied for a gag order. Jack Smith applied for a gag order with the judge. The judge granted it, at least in part. Now, what did she say? What did she grant Jack Smith?
The Biden Justice Department, through Jack Smith, applied to have Donald Trump basically be shut down for making all manner of disparaging statements in a way that I think would have severely implicated his campaign for office. Now, Judge Tanya Chutkan is an Obama appointee to the bench. She was unanimously supported in the United States Senate, by the way, for her final confirmation.
95-0, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, not exactly a contentious nominee, but in any case, she is an Obama appointee, and one would assume, based on prior rulings, quite left politically. I just say that as background. But what she has said in her ruling, Mark, is that Donald Trump is not above or below the law, and that, like any criminal defendant, he's not allowed to make certain statements. And she references a number of precedents in this area that, there is a tension between the First Amendment right and the restriction on what you can say going into trial, so that you don't sort of poison the well. And so she has tried with her ruling. And I think if you want my read on it, it does seem crafted not by the most nefarious never-Trumper, but instead a federal judge is taking her role seriously. And so, he's prohibited from making statements against the special prosecutor himself and the court staff and that sort of thing. But she says explicitly that he may criticize the government generally, including the current administration or the Department of Justice. So it's not like there's any restriction on what he might say about Joe Biden, for instance.
Okay, now, I think in most cases, a lot of people would consider that fair. Maybe not fair, because, there's a very strong First Amendment issue.
Let's just full stop. I want you to put a pin in your question when I say we have to always remember, and I do like to always point it out, that the decision to prosecute is a political decision. This was a political decision by the Biden administration to go after Trump criminally.
Well, this is where I'm coming from on this. So Donald Trump is allowed to criticize Joe Biden without being, and let's be fair, he could either be fined, have things weigh against him in the court, or even be put in jail if he goes against this order. Is that correct?
Those are typical remedies for contempt, and that's what it would be if he went against the judge's order.
Okay, so Joe Biden can't be former President Donald Trump can't be jailed,
sanctioned, we should say. You're right.
Sure.
In any case,
for speaking against Joe Biden, but he can be for speaking against Jack Smith. Yes. Now, Jack Smith, the prosecutor in the case, this is why I find this one quite strange, because Jack Smith personally has demonstrated bias in the past, and he has been sanctioned by the Supreme Court, no less, for overstepping his prosecutorial role against a former Republican governor. Isn't that right?
Make no mistake about it. The judge recognizes that this ruling is an imposition against Donald Trump's free speech. It absolutely is. And she recognizes it as such. And also, under our current precedent, it's permitted to restrict a defendant's free speech rights when those free speech rights implicate the integrity of the process, the prosecutor, court staff, etc. And so saying that Donald Trump is subject to these rules, just like any other criminal defendant might be, I hear you saying, well, yeah, but it's, this is a bit of a different case. And while it's true, this is a bit of a different case, applying the law to Donald Trump like she would any other defendant is actually the appropriate thing to do for the judge. In other words, it's not like they've manufactured, it would be one thing if, for instance, Joe Biden himself decided, well, I'm a lawyer and I'm the president, I'll be the prosecutor. And that way, Trump can't say anything bad about me, for instance. That would be gaming the system, presumably, to effectively muzzle Donald Trump. It doesn't seem like Mr. Smith's appointment as special prosecutor was done so that Donald Trump would then be unable to criticize Mr. Smith going forward in the election, right? It's just a natural outgrowth of him being the prosecutor. So it just doesn't read to me, Mark, like this is some let's muzzle Donald Trump effort. By the way, on behalf of the judge, it clearly is an effort to do so by the administration, without question, I think. But I don't think that we can throw Judge Chutkan into the bucket of they're all out to get him. Now,
okay, just everybody else.
I'm not saying that it's
the judge.
Yeah.
Okay, so will Donald Trump try and appeal this particular gag order? Because it is a First Amendment issue, and the judge, as you say, rightly points out that there's a balance to be made there. And if there's a balance to be made, that also means, by its very nature, that there's an argument to be made. So will Donald Trump challenge this?
He has said he will appeal the ruling of the court, Mark. But one of the things that we need to think about is when we evaluate the likelihood of success of any kind of appeal like this is, as you say, it's a balancing test. And that's why we have judges in order to, I had a philosophy professor who used to say that a good philosopher is like a good butcher. They know where to cut. And the same thing could be true for a judge. Yeah. And the idea that this decision of hers was so outside the bounds of her authority or the current case law that it should somehow be reversed pre-trial or in an interlocutory appeal, I think is out of bounds, and I don't think he will be successful, at least initially, with this kind of appeal.
Okay, well, we'll be following that on the pages of Liberty Nation. Now, libertynation.com. Very quickly, I want to talk about some other slight presidential shenanigans. And I know, Scott, that you're not a huge fan of this particular story, but I think it's worth mentioning just for the sheer chutzpah of present-day Democrats. And now,
or chutzpah even.
Chutzpah. Former President Barack Obama is tangentially connected to a case that's just concluded, whereby a rapper from the Fugees has been found guilty of acting as an agent to funnel money, millions of dollars from China, so presumably from the Chinese government, into Barack Obama's election campaigns to become president. And he's been found guilty of that. And the story that's most recent is that the lawyer in the closing statement used AI to help craft. Now, that's interesting in itself. But what I find most interesting is that most of the people in the entire world do not know that Barack Obama won the election, presumably with the aid of millions of dollars that came illegally funneled in from China. What's your take?
Well, yeah. So Pras is the rapper in question, and the story, the most recent story, is that he's saying through new lawyers that his old lawyer didn't do a good job for him because he used AI to craft arguments, and therefore he deserves a new trial, basically, on these charges. Now, to your question about what do I make of the Obama using illegal campaign contributions to fund his presidential run, I would say that if we recall, Mark, the story we just spoke about of Donald J. Trump being prosecuted criminally, it's good to have the prosecutor on your side because then you don't get prosecuted when you break the law. And it's bad if they're against you because then they can just use the law as a weapon against you.
Yeah, I think it would be a wonderful situation to ask people who are specifically against Donald Trump that if it was found out that Donald Trump got elected in 2016 due to millions of dollars of funds secretly pushed into his campaign by the Russians, should everything that Donald Trump did as president be automatically reversed? And then wait to see their faces drop when you ask the same question about Barack Obama. Anyway, I just think that'd be a wonderful thought experiment. Scott
Consistency is the hobgoblin of the conservative mind, Mark.
I love that phrase. Consistency is the hobgoblin of the conservative mind. Scott DeCosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Cheers.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests and you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in at home. We appreciate you, and we'll catch up next week. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.